Samuel Beckett was an Irishman who lived most of his life in France. Throughout his life, Beckett, quietly but uncompromisingly, avoided personal publicity. A Nobel Prize winner, he believed writers are never interesting in themselves. For him, the work was all that mattered.
When my father died in 1954, Sam became very, very important for me. He took over my father's role. And of course, when I went to Paris to study the flute, which was at his instigation, as well as my flute teachers, then there was the start of a very close relationship indeed. My first contact with his work was when I was at school, and they had a copy of Godot in the library. And I took it out of the library and wrote to Sam to say, I've just taken a copy of Godot out of the school library. And the reply came back quite quickly, I'd wait a few years if I were you. And I think he was quite right, because I didn't make much of it then.
Beckett's first radio play was All That Fall, and he wanted to hear it, and it went out on the third program in 1957, and they said, you can listen to it in Paris, you can hear that. But of course the reception was so bad that he couldn't hear it, so they sent him a tape, and this is how he discovered tape recording. He was very much concerned with the concept of time, and tape recording actually preserves time. In other words, once you have a voice on tape, that voice is alive forever. And so this inspired him to write the play Krapp's Last Tape. Krapp is a man who records a summary of his last year on every birthday.
Mother, at rest at last. The black ball. Black ball?
And of course, Krapp's Last Tape is largely an autobiographical piece. There are many episodes in it which one knows happened to Beckett himself, the death of his mother, and so on.
Box 3, spool 5. Spool. Spool.
The midwife was none other than a Dr. Haddon. It being a public holiday, your father left the house soon after his breakfast with a flask and a package of his favorite egg sandwiches for a tramp in the mountains. There was nothing unusual in this, but on that particular morning, his love of walking and wild scenery was not the only mover. When he returned at nightfall, he learned to his dismay from the maid at the back door that labor was still in swing. Though footsore and weary, he was on the point of setting out anew across the fields in the young moonlight when the maid came running to tell him it was over at last. Over?
Samuel Beckett was born on Good Friday, April the 13th, 1906, in the Dublin suburb of Fox Rock. He was the second son of William and May Beckett.
It was a very elegant house, a lovely big hall, and a lovely drawing room where there was a piano. And we all used to line up in a queue to have a go at the piano. Sam would play, then Frank, and then Molly and I, but we would wait our turn till we could get in and out. I must have gone to the Beckett family as a baby, and Sam was born 15 months later. As we grew a bit older, he couldn't say Sheila, so always called me Ely. And then that went on all the time, he called me Ely. And then as we got older, it turned into Eli, and it stayed like that. All his last letters or contacts with me were Eli, which I loved. Uncle Bill was very warm. He was jolly and fun, but one felt he was a man's man. Aunt May was much more reserved, I thought. But he was a darling, Sam, because he loved animals. I remember on one occasion, the gardener came in to say, "Come out, we've caught a rat in the trap." And Sam rushed out and said, "You must let it out. I can't bear it." You see, he was so wonderfully gentle inside and easily hurt.
Winter vest was once like when I was in short trousers. Now the day is over, night is drawing nigh, shadows of the evening steal across the sky. Went to sleep and fell off the pew.
All the Becketts loved sport, and Sam was no exception, winning medals and trophies at rugby, cricket, boxing, golf, and tennis.
He was a great walker, and he and his father were so close. They could walk for miles and miles, and he told me they knew each other so well they didn't have to talk. They just sort of tuned in, which was so lovely with a parent, I think.
Yes, I was my father and I was my son. I asked myself questions and answered as best I could. I had it told to me evening after evening, the same old story I knew by heart and couldn't believe. Or we walked together, hand in hand, silent, sunk in our worlds, each in his worlds, the hands forgotten in each other.
My main connection with Beckett was in the early days, and my main meeting with him arose because of my connection with Carrickmines Golf Club, which I entered as a Trinity member in 1924, about the spring of that year. Now, Beckett was a reasonably good golfer, and I was a reasonably good golfer, so that we were thrown together as people who could play each other and enjoy the games. We were photographed together. I have a photograph of that.
Beckett family are associated with this club now for years. Sam was a remarkably good golfer. He played off 2-3 handicap, which I suppose would be equivalent to a 5 or 6 handicapper the present day. He had a type of swing, you know. There was nothing extraordinary about it. He looked skillful, which undoubtedly he was, but if I may, he swung the club in being tall, he leaned over quite a bit, you know, and had rather a flat swing. That's what we describe as a flat swing, you know. You're not up here, you're a bit bit this way at it, you know. But he got results.
Beckett was a brilliant student from Portora, and he was doing modern language, and he was a brilliant modern language student. He was head of his class all the time. I was what I suppose you would call a Midland scholar only. His university studies came to an end, and he's got his degree, a brilliant degree he got. I think he got a gold medal in modern languages.
Trinity College sent a lecturer in English to Normal Superior, and Normal Superior sent a lecturer in French to Trinity College. And the next day I was in Normal Superior, I found a note, and that note said, I'm supposed to be your lecturer in English. Shall we meet tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock? And it was signed Samuel Beckett. Dublin, compared to Paris, and particularly that extraordinary life in Montparnasse, and in the cinema, in the theater, and in the concert hall, Dublin was, shall I say, nothing, really, nothing. Practically all the poets, all the writers, and all the painters were there. I mean, one of the first nights I was there was Picasso sitting at a table, and Chagall was sitting at another table, and André Breton and the Surrealists were sitting at another table, and all that, you know, it was just like that.
Beckett was 22 when he left Dublin for Paris. 26 years before, at the age of 20, James Joyce made the same journey. With an introduction from poet and fellow Irishman Thomas McGreevy, Beckett soon met Joyce. He was greatly impressed.
The meeting with Joyce had a huge impact, such an impact that I had the impression that he would never get out of it, finally. Once he was in Joyce, I had the impression that he would never get out. Well, I mean, Joyce, you know, Joyce was a very powerful, he had a powerful grip on the people. When Joyce telephoned to you and said, would you be free this afternoon by any chance, and could you spare me 1 or 2 hours? Well, I mean, you couldn't say no. You couldn't say no. You had to say yes. And you went, naturally, I mean, and it was an enchantment. I was indignant about Sam, you know, for quite a few years, because when he brought out Horoscope, for instance, well, I mean, this was typically Joycean, you know. Well, I mean, I had the impression that he was going to be a Joycean adept.
Day after day, he could be seen slowly pacing the islet. Hour after hour, in his long black coat, no matter what the weather, and old world Latin Quarter hat. With never a word exchanged, they grew to be as one.
Beckett returned to Dublin in 1930. At the age of 24, with the support of his friend and mentor, Professor Thomas Rudmose Brown, he was appointed lecturer in French at Trinity College.
Of course, we were all in place when he came in, and he swept in his MA gown, and he did not, it was a very small classroom. There were just about, I think, 3 rows of desks, and his desk was very close to the front row, so he, instead of looking at all his students, he always turned sideways with his back to the window and talked to the far corner of the room, rather than look into the faces of all the students in front of him. When it came up to final exams, Roddy Brown suggested I should go to see Mr. Samuel Beckett, and he asked me to come to his room in Clare Street, which is at the back of Trinity College, and he had a room in there full of cigarette smoke, a table absolutely covered with books and papers, and black coffee on the desk, and of course a huge tray of cigarette ends. He smoked the whole time, but he was much more relaxed than when he was in lecturing. He could just talk naturally, and I really took everything in that he said.
In January 1932, having taught for just 4 terms, Beckett abruptly resigned his academic post. A 4-line poem was his brief indictment of the scholarly life.
Spend the years of learning squandering courage for the years of wandering through a world politely turning from the loutishness of learning.
Even at that time, he was ploughing his own furrow. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. Well, didn't know exactly what he wanted to do, but knew there was something that had to be done. And he was always, he continued like that. But of course, for a young man at that time to be doing that, and that furrow didn't coincide with the one that his parents had mapped out for him. And I know that at one stage his father thought, well, if all else fails, we can get him a job in the brewery. It's Guinness's brewery.
I had gone in as an article clerk in a firm of accountants in Dublin. And I told Sam that I had found people in these offices who were not, hadn't the benefit of an education from a university, and they were people whom I found, normal people, whom I found most interesting. And he turned to me and he said, I'm not interested in normal. I'm only interested in the abnormal. Now, that was the time that I found mentally that he and I were moving apart.
Hard to believe I was ever that young whelp. The voice, Jesus, and the aspirations, and the resolutions. To drink less in particular. Statistics. 1,700 hours out of the preceding 8,000 odd consumed on licensed premises alone. More than 20%, say 40% of his waking life. Plans for a less engrossing sexual life. Last illness of his father, flagging pursuit of happiness, unattainable laxation, sneers at what he calls his youth, and thanks to God it's over. False ring there.
Samuel Beckett's favourite relative was his father's only sister, his Aunt Sissy. She had married a Bohemian art dealer, William Sinclair, known affectionately as Boss Sinclair. They had 4 daughters. Sam was greatly attracted to one of them.
This was a portrait that was painted by one of the people who visited our house, a man called Lyhausen, who painted the picture of my sister, Peggy. She was 70, 18, that sort of age at that time. Well, Peggy and Sam met when Peggy and I came on holiday to Ireland, and she was 17. And Sam they fell in love with each other. And then when we returned to Germany, he came to see us very soon after that.
Und in den Küche, wo stahl dem Koch ein Ei. Da nahm der Koch einen Löffel und schlug den Hund zu Brei.
There was a special poem that Sam liked, which I learned in school. He asked me to repeat it, and then he laughed and thought it was such a funny thing. And the second act of Waiting for Godot, Vladimir starts off with the poem.
A dog came in the kitchen and stole a crust of bread, then cooked up with the ladle and beat him till he was dead. Then all the dogs came running and dug the dog a tomb. And so it goes on.
My father was an art dealer, my mother was a painter, and we had many friends who were from the art world and painters, and young painters at that time, in Germany. And it was a regular thing to go to the gallery and entertain painters in the house. And Sam loved all the casualness, I think, and the easygoing life.
This is the Landgrafenstraße where Sam came to visit us first. We lived on the 3rd floor, very small flat with a dark corridor, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms and a sitting room, and there were 5 children and my parents. So it was a bit of a squash, to say the least of it. And my mother cared for us all. Particularly was anxious about Sam because he ate very little, and she used to buy special things for him. And I think here he first felt a great affinity with Germany and the culture here. Peggy and Sam loved each other. And they must have come to this river, and this was your boating on the river, and this was in Krapp's last tape. This water, people swimming, people rowing, enjoying the water and the willows.
Upper lake with the punt, bathed off the bank, then pushed out into the stream and drifted. She lay stretched out on the floorboards with her hands under her head and her eyes closed. I said again I thought it was hopeless and no good going on, and she agreed without opening her eyes. I asked her to look at me, and after a few moments she did. But the eyes just slits because of the glare. I bent over her to get them in the shadow, and they opened. Let me in. We drifted in among the flags and stuck. The weather went down, sighing before the stem.
Well, I don't know what happened because I was too young, but I've heard that they wanted to marry, but that it was frowned on by the family because they were first cousins. And I really can't tell you any more than that about it. I wasn't kept informed. I was too young. Very soon she went away to school to learn. It was a music and dancing school in Austria, near Vienna. And she must have been 18 at that time, 19 say, but she contracted tuberculosis. And she died when she was 21 in Germany. And we returned to Ireland at that time, just after that. That was 1933, and Hitler had come into power.
While he could manage it, Beckett travelled about the continent, mostly in Germany. He visited galleries, he studied, he idled, before returning jobless, tail between his legs, to his Dublin home in Foxrock.
Mr. Beckett lived on Brighton Road, Cooldraina. We all knew where Cooldraina was. And of course, when the postman would go there with his post, they had to make sure that Mrs. Beckett's Kerry Blue wasn't out. one of the postmen was singing postman. He was named Mr. John Thompson. And then you had the other man who was Dignam. That's the man with the one eye. Well, then you had, in the railway station was Tommy Farrell. He was the station master. And his father before him was station master.
How long have you been master of this station now, Mr. Barrell?
Don't ask me, Mrs. Rooney, don't ask me.
You stepped into your father's shoes, I believe, when he took them off.
Poor Pappy. He didn't live long to enjoy his ease.
I remember him clearly.
Mrs. Beckett came up on a horse, and she was all dressed in black, and she was looking for my sister for to go as a parlour maid, but she had already got a job, so she said to me, could I go? Would I like to go? Could I clean out a fire and could I dust and things like that? And I said yes, so she said, well, I'll take you on a month's trial. If I made a mistake, I'd be reprimanded about it, and Mr. Beckett said, leave the girl alone, she's only training. He wouldn't mind, but Mrs. Beckett was very particular. There was Mr. Beckett, Mrs. Beckett and Mr. Beckett, and Mr. Frank and Mr. Sam. And then they had a donkey, and his name was Kish. And Mrs. Beckett had a trap made, and she used to go out for drives in it.
He was at home less than a year when in June 1933 his father died of a heart attack.
I think his father's death really affected him far more than anybody thought. And from then on he was sort of searching for something inside. And I think this perhaps helped him in his writings to express this inner sadness or loss, I'm not sure which. He really seemed an unhappy person after that in France when he was doing his creative work. The whole thing was trying to give birth to this something inside that had disturbed him.
When he chuckled, you tried to chuckle too. When his chuckle died, yours too. That you should try to imitate his chuckle pleased and tickled him greatly, and sometimes he would chuckle for no other reason than to hear you try to chuckle too.
Overwhelmed by his father's death, Beckett wrote to his friend Thomas McGreevy.
All the little things come back. Memoir de l'Escalier. I can't write about him. I can only walk the fields and climb the ditches after him.
Beckett left Ireland again, and this time headed for London, where he spent 2 miserable years. Depressed and confused, he put together a collection of poems and began to write his first novel, Murphy.
The sun shone, having no alternative on the nothing new. Murphy sat out of it as though he were free, in a mew in West Brompton.
This is the cockpit in High Park, facing the Serpentine. And Beckett, when he was living in London in the 30s, used to come and walk here very frequently, and he would lie on the grass and think about his novel. And it was the first novel to be published in 1938. Unfortunately, it did not do very well. Most of the copies were destroyed in 1940 in the Blitz.
She had turned out of Edith Grove into Cremorne Road, intending to refresh herself with a smell of the Reach, and then return by Lots Road. When, chancing to glance to her right, she saw, motionless in the mouth of Stadium Street, considering alternately the sky and a sheet of paper, a man. Murphy.
This is Stadium Road. Beckett lived around here in the 30s when he was writing his novel Murphy. And Murphy, the character of Murphy, is very like Beckett himself and based on him. It's a very funny novel, but it's also a very black one because Beckett was going through a bad patch. He was not quite sure if he was ever going to make it as a writer and how great his talent really was. But it's one of the few novels where places are very exactly named. Cremorne Road, which is right in front of me, Stadium Road here, Lots Road round the corner, Edith Grove behind me, all places that are named in the novel Murphy, and places where Murphy wanders around London, as Beckett himself did, usually in a very depressed state. I think that he certainly went through a period where he was very worried about his own talent, very worried about his own sanity. But the family were perfectly normal. They just couldn't understand how they produced, you know, this queer character who simply wanted to go away and write in a way that nobody could seem to be able to read, you know. I mean, he was certainly not taken up in any way by the Dublin literary establishment. They couldn't understand him either. He certainly wanted an audience. I remember once we were having a rather black conversation about the state of the world, and he said, oh, it would be better if the whole muck heap just blew up and ended all. And I said, but then there'd be nobody left to read you. And there was a long pause. He didn't like it very much.
17 copies sold, of which 11 at trade price to free circulating libraries beyond the seas. Getting known. £1, 6 and something. 8, I have little doubt.
Sam's mother would have found it, I think, impossible to understand. It was just something that wasn't in her comprehension. This sort of life, writing, what's that? He's not writing for anybody. It was something I'm sure she would have found almost impossible to understand.
I came down here with Frank yesterday evening. It is a great relief to me to get away from home, where the position between Mother and me has become impossible. I was wrong in thinking I was well enough to deal with her, and with myself in relation to her. Now I give it up une fois pour toutes.
I don't think he meant to disagree with his mother too much, but sometimes he really couldn't accept some of the things he was expected to do. Sam sometimes wasn't easy, and their relationship was a bit strained, but really, deep down, there was a deep love on both sides, especially when they were far apart. He used to do lovely things, send her roses from Paris, if it was a birthday or something special. He always remembered her, and their relationship, I'm sure, was great love and respect, but she did get a little disturbed if he wasn't doing what she wanted him to do.
She was very worried about him when he was away and that, and we used to write to him, and we used to send him a few pounds now and then, rolled up in the newspaper on the quiet, just in case he needed it. But Mr. Sam used to only come home now and then, and he'd be off away in France or London or somewhere. But when he'd be there, he loved the piano. He played the piano a lot. And he'd be there and he'd be writing. And Mrs. Beckett said she couldn't make head or tail of the writing. However, he used to write an awful lot. But he was real casual, you know. There wasn't a bit of bother, and he was very friendly. And sometimes he'd go away and he'd say, "I won't come back till I'm an old man with a beard."
I'll be here till I die, creeping along genteel roads on a stranger's bike.
In 1937, I was a member of the academic staff here. I was assistant in geology, and I was a member of the Common Room Club, and there had just started in the courts this libel action case where Oliver St. John Gogarty had written his biography as I was walking down Sackville Street, and this pair of brothers, the Sinclairs, pounced on this verse in the text and alleged that they could be personally identified in it and that they had been libeled by it because they were described rather coarsely in it. Whereas Sam Beckett, who was a relative of the Sinclairs, was called to support their case and claimed that he had recognized them in the poem. But unfortunately, Gogarty had retained John Mary Fitzgerald, who was one of the leading people at the Irish bar, and a brilliant orator and cross-questioner, and he had himself taken a first-class honours degree in French in this college, and he knew all about French literature and French authors and how to pronounce their names. Anyway, he took Beckett very quickly through the bit about recognising it, and then he hoisted himself for the kill.
How long did it take before your book was banned by the Censorship Board of Ireland?
About 6 months.
I suggest it was banned because it was a blasphemous and obscene book.
I never discovered why it was banned.
Do you call yourself a Christian, Jew, or atheist?
None of the three.
He turned to Beckett and he said, "Oh, you've been in Paris," with some emphasis on Paris for some years, Mr. Beckett. "Yes." "And you've written a number of books." "Yes." "And you've also written about some French writer called Proust, I think." So poor Sam rose to the bait and said, in a rather supercilious tone, "Are you referring to the distinguished French author Proust?" And Beckett, Fitzgerald didn't say another word. He just looked at the jury and his glance that said more than any words, "How can we honest Dubliners be expected to know how to pronounce the names of these dirty foreign writers?" and sat down. It was devastating. This was done deliberately with the purpose of destroying Beckett as a reliable witness, and unfortunately carried the consequence that I think it so disgusted Beckett with Dublin that he immediately returned to Paris, and his later Dublin visits, I think, were only very short and only when they couldn't be avoided.
Let me say, before I go any further, that I forgive nobody. I wish them all an atrocious life, and then the fires and ice of hell, and in the execrable generations to come, an honoured name.
On the 11th of January, the Irish Times carried a report on the stabbing of an Irish writer in Paris. Beckett had been knifed in the street the previous day and was recovering in hospital.
Dear Tom, I shall be all right as far as I can see. The pleura were wounded, but apparently not the lung. First, I was in a ward. Then Joyce had me moved into a private room. Everyone has been incredibly kind. Mother, Frank, and Jean came.
A woman of his acquaintance read of the same incident in a French newspaper and immediately went to visit him. She was Suzanne Deschevaux de Menil, a pianist and music teacher, originally from the small town of Troyes and now living in Paris. It was the beginning of a lifelong relationship. Music was their great interest, though Suzanne did on one occasion try her hand at literature and published a tiny fragment of her own in Transition. Beckett translated and wrote a note about the contributor.
Suzanne Dumnil, forgotten in musical, unknown in literary circles.
After the stabbing incident, Beckett found a new apartment at 6 Rue de Favourite in the 15th arrondissement.
Here with my new address. People have been good with presents to get me started, but it is a terribly expensive business. I like the place. It is bright and comfortable, and I like the quartier, well away from the stage artists.
Suzanne, qui avait besoin de jouer du piano, ne pouvait guère le faire chez elle.
Suzanne loved to play the piano, but she couldn't always do so at her apartment in Rue des Favorites or later at Boulevard Saint-Jacques, because a piano is disturbing for neighbors and for one's companion, so I invited her to come here on Fridays while I was away. She gladly accepted my invitation. It was like a second home for her on Fridays. She could play the piano here at her ease. She did not wish to disturb anybody, and she was also anxious that nobody should listen to her playing.
I was 33 this week, and wonder if the second half of the bottle will be any better than the first half. If there is a war, as I fear there must be soon, I shall place myself at the disposition of this country.
He was in Dublin when the war broke out, and he went rushing back to France to be with his French friends and got involved in the resistance. And he saw, of course, all the things that happen in warfare, the terrible things that happen to an oppressed population.
Sam, being Irish, was neutral, so could be in Paris without fear of imprisonment. But he couldn't stand by and see what was happening to his friends. So he got involved with the resistance. And eventually, of course, one of his group were captured, talked, and of course, the Gestapo came looking for him. A friend of Suzanne's, Roger Delertre, had a sister who lived in Roussillon. And Roussillon, of course, was in the so-called free part of France. Although the Germans were there, they were patrolling it. So even if they went there, they went in a position of total safety. But they got down there some way, with great difficulty, and spent the war down in Roussillon.
Quelle sorte de travail en général ce qu'il a fait? Vous pouvez raconter un peu, oui.
Chez nous, les raisins, ramasse les raisins.
He picked the grapes and the cherries.
Les gerbes.
He gathered the wheat.
On n'avait pas les moissonneuses.
At that time, we didn't have modern machinery.
On foulait. Vous savez,
He worked the land,
on foulait
planted the
sur
wheat,
on mettait
and dug the
les gerbes,
fields.
Et puis les chevaux tournaient.
Alors c'est uniquement...
Les deux, je crois que c'est les deux que...
He worked for my father and the Bonelli family.
Oui, il y avait quand même un élément de danger ici, parce que c'était un Irlandais qui voulait se cacher.
Voilà, je crois qu'il y avait du danger.
Oh yes, I think there was danger from the moment he hid himself. During the war, everybody lived in fear.
Tout le monde était en danger.
Everybody here was
Pendant
in
la guerre,
danger.
tout le monde était en danger ici.
C'est ça. Et en général, les gens d'ici, ils croyaient qu'il était un travailleur.
On savait, en dernier lieu,
You know, it was only at the last minute he explained to us that he was a writer. But he didn't show us his work. He didn't talk to us about his business.
Ses affaires, il avait raison.
He was right.
À cette époque-là, il fallait...
He had kept his secret.
He wrote What during the war, and the genesis of Godot in particular came from there. I mean, we know that Godot is set in the Vaucluse, where he was, and it is exactly about man's inhumanity to man, about trying to survive in difficult times when anybody you meet is likely to be a bully. I mean, Pozzo, in a way, represents the Germans, I think.
But down there, everything is red. I didn't notice anything, I tell you.
You're a hard man to get on with, Gogo.
It'd be better if we parted.
You always say that. And you always come crawling back.
The best thing would be to kill me, like the other.
What other? What other?
Like billions of others.
Terrible period, terrible. Not only strange, but I mean real breakups too, you know. Terrible, terrible. I mean, France never recovered from that, you know. I was not on the other side. I mean, I was on my side, if I may say so. I know that some people from the Resistance came to see me, and you know, I belonged to the Vichy government for 9 months, and I was kicked out by Pierre Laval. And kicked out, I prefer not saying what way, because it was very dangerous. I could have been taken by the Germans and sent to a camp, you know, and I wouldn't be there at present, very probably. He disappeared during the occupation, and he was on his side, and I was on mine, and I didn't know where he was. I remember I asked questions, and nobody answered. Nobody knew where he was. And as he was in the Resistance, of course, people wouldn't say, naturally.
Beckett refused to discuss his work for the resistance. He dismissed his wartime activities as Boy Scout stuff. Whatever his actions, they were evidently successful, for after the war, General de Gaulle conferred on Samuel Beckett the Croix de Guerre.
After the Second World War, Sam called and said he was in London. Could he come now and see us, which he did. He was looking really very ill, very emaciated. His teeth were bad, everything was bad, and he was going home to Ireland to see his mother.
He was distressed to find she had aged, suffering from Parkinson's disease. He stayed in Ireland for 6 weeks caring for his mother, and during this time experienced what he would later, with some embarrassment, identify as a revelation.
Spiritually, a year of profound gloom and indigence, until that memorable night in March at the end of the jetty in the howling wind, never to be forgotten, when suddenly I saw the whole thing, the vision at last. This, I fancy, is what I have chiefly to record this evening, against the day when my work will be done and perhaps no place left in my memory, warm or cold, for the miracle that... for the fire that set it alight. What I suddenly saw then was this, that the belief I had been going on all my life, namely... Great granite rocks, the foam flying up in the light of the lighthouse, and the wind gauge spinning like a propeller, clear to me at last that the dark I have always struggled to keep under is in reality my most... unshatterable association, until my dissolution of storm and night with the light of the understanding and the fire.
All the jetty and howling wind are imaginary. It happened to me summer 1945 in my mother's little house named New Place, across the road from Cooldraina.
Beckett saw he was on the wrong lines. He said to hell with enrichment, let's get impoverished. To write and explore his true self, he did something astonishing. He changed languages. The new language Beckett chose was an old one, French. The task he set himself was not easy, but the challenge enabled him to escape from inherited literary traditions. The immediate post-war years would be the most sustained and creative of Samuel Beckett's life. Within a decade, he would write and publish a prose trilogy, and with the play Waiting for Godot, connect with a worldwide audience.